Okay.
Yes.
All right. So this is part of it has to do with the walk score, which is one of several metrics that the planning department uses to rank prioritize projects. And it's a metric that I've been personally have pushed to use because I think by using more objective data that can be beneficial to the process, remove some of the bias we might have as humans in the system. The walk score, sometimes people talk loosely about it as a walkability score, but planners, including ours, know that it means something more specific for planning. It's a gauge of pedestrian demand. I have our definition that we use here in Bloomington. The score gauges pedestrian demand based on proximity to a mix of commercial destinations. It doesn't account for demographic factors. So it doesn't also account for the current walk conditions there. So if something has a high walk score, it means it has a lot of potential, but no sidewalks. That would be the kind of project that the metric would recommend prioritizing. So I highlighted the word proximity on the last slide, and I wanted to check what that meant with the people who make walk score, because it can mean two things. It can mean physical distance, or it can mean how long it takes to walk there. And they're doing the more advanced method. So walk score is not how physically close things are, but how long it would take you to walk there. And that's what's ended up being an interesting distinction that I looked more into. So we're going to look at some distances of that I think some examples of this physical distance versus routing distance, the walk route that turned out to be significant. Let's see. So I'm going to start with two apartments that are downtown. Morton Street are newer apartments. I think some of them can cost a little more, and they're sort of right on the grid. And so I picked two that were right next to each other, and they have, or I should say, a block away, about 500 feet away, or it says 307 feet away. They have about the same walk score, which makes sense. They're both on the grid. They can get to the same connections. So it makes sense that they would have the same amount of walk score. So that's sort of the control group. So now we're going to look at another set of apartments, multi-family housing that are not connected to the network. And you can see where my mouse is surrounding. That's the Arlington Valley Mobile Park. And here I have a couple points, and those are the 2 points we're looking at. They're 150 feet apart. But their physical distance to nearly all of the destinations nearby is the same. There's a Kroger's over here, an elementary school. There are some gas stations and other stores around here. And so they're physically, so that's what's interesting about them. They have different routing distances, but the very similar physical distance. And here's how the walk scores compare in those cases. So the inside, on one side of the fence, you get a walk score of 26. And on the outside, you get a walk score of 50. This is on a scale of 1 to 100. And this can, so the next question is like, well, so what? What if you have a walk score of 26, and what if you have a walk score of 50? Like, how would that impact planning? So I looked at a spreadsheet, and you can see some of the other metrics we use. We have a pedestrian level of service, transit routing, density routing. I love that we're taking all these metrics and pulling them together, but I happened to pick on one row that had that exact value. It had a value of 26 for the walk score, and it ranked at 41st for a project we would prioritize. So number 1 would get done first, and that project was going to get done 41st. So I thought, well, what would happen if I changed that walk score from a 26 to a 50? It's essentially like, what would happen if there was a hole in the fence? Like, what would happen if those streets were connected instead of disconnected? And that walk score jumps, when you change it to a 50, the priority, the rank in our spreadsheet would jump from 41st place to 27th place. And currently we're funding about 2 sidewalk projects a year. So for the lack of a hole in the fence, for the lack of that route being connected, it changes, like, it equates to like 7 years, really. So the walk score would prioritize updates on one side of the fence and not the other. So what I was finding was the walk score was sort of blind to fixing physical barrier problems. And if you look at how apartments can be set up, especially lower income apartments, they're more likely to have these these barriers that block them out from other places. As low income is also correlated, it's more likely to be where some of the Black people in our community are living as well. So it does have equity concerns. But one data point is not science, right? So I went to look to see what else I could find to find other cases. So I went to see, I moved across town to Meadow Park, Stevens Drive. This is another case where in the foreground, it's a single family housing. In the background, it's a large apartment complex. And it's just clearly artificially disconnected. There's a little fence here. There's actually a runner here. You think they're going through a sidewalk, but it's actually a steep drainage ditch. And I rode up that drainage ditch on my bike once, and the bump was so significant that my watch started to call for help. That it clearly thought I was someplace I shouldn't be, and they clearly hadn't tested the Garmin watch riding up these sorts of drainage ditch. So I want to show you this same area on the Google map. So in the foreground, we were looking at Stevens Drive, and in down here where I'm moving my mouse, that's the apartment complex. What's pretty interesting to me is this little connection here. That's the drainage ditch. And I had added that route to OpenStreetMap as a bikeable, walkable route to improve the walk directions. And Google Maps apparently imported that, and it's now used on the walk score as a walk and bike routable place. And it turned out it impacted their walk score, because the walk score site will show you which routes they're using, and they're now choosing to walk bicycles and pedestrians through the drainage ditch, because frankly, it's better than going all the way around. So let's see what happened. Then I wanted to look at the walk score just inside and outside of the apartment complex to see what would happen. And something different happened here. So outside in the single family neighborhood, we got a walk score of 35. And now there's a hole in the fence. The walk score just inside was 33. And I'm going to show you later that this slide I put up is actually wrong. And it was another problem I found with the walk score methodology. And I only found the error late in making the presentation, so I didn't go back and fix the slide. But this number isn't quite right. But I just wanted to show you that not every case is the same. So, so then I picked a third case, the walking to Denny's case. One of the densest part of our towns, from looking at a density map, is up by the bypass. And this is, if you're familiar with Miller Showers Park, it's right over here. So that's the Miller Showers Park, and there's a lot of apartments over there. So I wanted to see what would happen for two apartments. And again, I found a fence, and there's two apartments, and now they're only 80 feet apart. And so let's check out what happens when they try to walk to Denny's. Okay, so on one side of the fence, you get a 6-minute walk to Denny's, and the neighbor on the other side of the fence has to walk almost 3 times as longer. It's like 15 minutes to get to Denny's. So pretty different distances to get to a destination. And it's just an artificial, if you zoom in enough on Google Maps, there's actually a door in the fence and stairs leading to it, but I've been by there and the door is locked, so you can't get through it. So let's see what happens with the walk score. And so here I got a result that the one that had the longer walk to Denny's got a better walk score, and that didn't make sense to me. And this was when I realized that I had, there was a problem, and that if you don't use walk score correctly, you get wrong results. So let's look at what happened. Okay, here's a corrected result. And I'll tell you, this is where I learned about what the problem was. Some of these apartment complexes are so large that if you just take the street address, it's like 400 feet from maybe the back of the apartment, which is where I was measuring. And normally on the walk score site, if you just put in an address, it's not doing the point that you're pointing at necessarily, it's doing a location of the street. And so I had to dig into their documentation, and I had to find the documentation for like, how do you get the walk score for a precise point? And that way I could get the walk score for the back of the apartment complex rather than the front, because that could be like half, a good percentage of your walk to get someplace. But the other thing I found, though, in this case that was one finding, but that a lot of the interesting destinations were to the south and not the north. So like Denny's is one point, but there's a whole bunch of things to the south of these places. And when these people in these two apartments walk south, they do, for a lot of cases, have a similar walk to where they're going. So that's like, so clearly there's different situations, and it's not all as dramatic as the first case I found, but I felt like it was still an area of more research to look to see if there's correlations in walk score and equity in apartments. So I also wanted to look at the other end of the spectrum. So, wealthier neighborhoods too are also disconnected. And so I wanted to look at what's going on with those. So here's one that's Tamaron. There's one way in, one way out, single family homes. So walk score would be biased against this situation, right? What about that? But the difference is, and here I've zoomed out, but I'm on a walk score map, so it has all the little place icons for other places. The difference there's a couple of important differences for like the wealthier disconnected suburb. First of all, they might not actually have, even if they were more physically connected, there's less likely to be actual destinations nearby to get to anyway. And you can see near Tamaron, even if you walk a while, you're not really going to get someplace anyway. The other is purely the question of money. If you're wealthier, you have options. You have the choice to live somewhere else. You can choose to live maybe in a more connected place or a place that costs less. And if your income is at the other end of the spectrum, you can't just choose. Then that you really stuck with the things that are in your price range. And those are more likely to be these apartments, which are more likely to have these barriers that break up the grid. So from there, I pivoted to like, well, what then? What do you do about that? So it turns out this issue is highlighted in our Bloomington's transportation plan. And this graphic over here is taken from it. And they are showing an example of a disconnected grid, and then down below it, a more idealized grid. And so it's one of the goals of our transportation plan. They don't frame it in terms of equity issue. In fact, there's a lot of reasons why you want to have a connected grid network. They highlight provides the most efficient distribution, improves emergency response, increases predictability, encourages people to walk, provides economic benefits. So there's lots of benefits to connect the grid. So I dug into more, like, oh, that's great. So what do we do? What happens from there? It's in the plan. What next? And so, first of all, a lot of the things in the plan are about connecting the grid. They're not necessarily looking at it explicitly through an equity lens, but if you search for the word grid, you'll find a lot of planned projects which are about connecting the grid. But there was one thing in there which I think could be appropriate for our commission to think about more. It had a goal of develop a street grid network policy. And as far as I'm aware, it's not something we've started on. It says the plan recommends several new connections that would lay the groundwork for a future grid. Bloomington should establish a policy to develop such a grid network when possible. It could be part and so on. So this is something that our group could look at more. First of all, we could look at what other cities are doing in terms of their street grid network policies. I didn't have time to go further into that. And I know the mayor is calling to rebuild and move forward with equity. And that wasn't language I saw a lot of in the transportation plan, although it came to some of the same conclusions, but it's something else we could, I think, work to infuse more in the conversation. And I think I'm near the end of my, oh yeah. So summary findings, I think we should do, I think it'd be good if locally or nationally, I'd like more research to be done on walk score to see if it has bias, which is impacting questions of equity. And that's a national question because it's being used other places. And care should be selected, particularly our planners have done a good job of disclaiming some of what walk score is good for and what it's not. And I think this is a place where we could add some more disclaimers about when we say proximity, we're talking, it's good for fixing problems along existing routes, but we need to make sure that our planning process is also recognizing that sometimes the biggest problem is the artificial disconnections in our grid. And the third, yeah, like I mentioned, I think we could be working on a street grid policy, and that's something that our group could start to look at. So that's it. Stop sharing my screen now.
It occurs to me, Mark, it occurs to me that I'm a fan of walk score. It's certainly not perfect, but I think in measuring, it was interesting to me that it seemed to give you a reason to cut a hole in the fence.
Yes, only
in other words, you could use walk score. You could use walk score to demonstrate why a fence needs to be opened up. It's not just, it becomes not just your opinion. So I was impressed that walk score even noticed the fence.
Yes, that's because it uses the walk routing and not the physical proximity metric.
Mm-hmm.
That's an example, Jim, of how it can still be a valuable metric. We just need to understand what it's good at and what it's telling us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think something you might also take into consideration would be when you just look at one destination. I think walk score probably takes in multiple destinations from each location, with a higher score getting really into a broad range of destinations. That's my guess.
Thank you, Jim. Are there anyone else who'd like to speak to that before we move on to new business?
Hi, Greg Alexander. Can I say a few words?
You may.
So I'm really just, this is really exciting, the direction this is taking. I thought after last month's presentation about it a little bit more, and I mean, the focus is really spot on. If you look at where low-income housing is of any type, whether it's a homeless shelter or apartments or trailers or anything, and you look at the nearest grocery store, there's people that walk that no matter how unpleasant it is, whether it's through a muddy ditch or a hole in a fence or whatever. But I was also thinking, if you look at any of these kind of arterials, like South College, it's the only street that goes past Hillside, or North College, the only street that goes past the train tracks, or like West 3rd Street and West Bloomfield Road, there's no connectivity out there. And you will have people, and I have no idea really where they're housed, but they are traveling 3 or 4 miles by foot. And that's just something else to think about, that even if it's very far away, if people don't have the money to have cars and they need more, you know, if they need to go at an hour the bus isn't, then there's no road that they won't use. It's not just like a localized neighborhood phenomenon. They'll travel long distances. Anyways, that's all I wanted to add. Thanks a bunch.
I could have added for more context that one of the challenges for city is land acquisition. It's an expensive and lengthy process. And this idea of punching a hole in the fences often involves private land. And I know that there's challenges with it, but I think also it may be something we need to look, maybe one of the hard problems that we need to work on to really fix our transportation in an equitable way.
Tom Zeller here for comment. You know, that private property, you know, the city could just go and ask those owners, would you mind opening this fence up? And, you know, maybe 20% of them would say, yeah, sure. There was no reason for that anyway. Just a thought.